Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. This is week 4, and we're starting off with Thursday Night Football with Seattle at Arizona. So let's dive right in. So, unfortunately, I still haven't gotten all the defensive stats I want to get. I'm close, I just have not had quite enough time this week to finish that out, so hopefully look forward to that this weekend for the Sunday games. So, instead, we'll just go through our typical overview that I've done for the last few games for Thursday night here. Looking at the money line, we have the Seahawks favored just slightly. We have even spread odds with the spread at 1.5 and a total line of 43.5 points. Looking at the teams a little bit more detailed, we now have 3 weeks, so that's why you'll see a bunch of 1/3 kind of numbers, 0.33 or 0.66. Seattle has about a middle range passing rank and a little under average rushing rank. Meanwhile, the Cardinals are near the bottom in the passing rank and are about mid range in the rushing rank. Seattle averages 226 passing yards per game, while the Cardinals only average 180 passing yards per game. Seattle averages 96 rushing yards per game, while the Cardinals average 111 average rushing yards per game. There's been a couple passing interceptions, meanwhile, only one with the Cardinals. And Seattle has a little bit of a harder time holding on to the ball since they've lost a sack fumble, a rushing fumble, and a receiving fumble. While the Cardinals have never lost a fumble. They had one rushing fumble, but haven't lost it. Looking at some of the defensive data, you have 8 QB hits on average per game for Seattle, where you have only 6.6 on average from the Cardinals. You have a couple interceptions, averaging 0.66 per game, and Seattle has quite a few more, with one averaging 1.66 interceptions per game. So they almost get 2 interceptions per game. You have a little better pass defended at the line here than Seattle does. Sacks are still both about at 2 average per game. And I think that's all that's really significant here. It'd be fun to rank the quarterbacks based on their passing yards and everything. Maybe I can get around to that next time. Let me know what you think. But that'd be kind of a fun thing to have in these panels. Looking at the fantasy points, you have Sam Darnold following a little bit behind Kyler Murray, with Kyler Murray having 46.4 points and Sam Darnold having 37.9 fantasy points. Starting with how much they've lost defensively, you have 2 interceptions for Sam Darnold, 3 sacks suffered, and 1 sack fumble lost. While Kyler Murray has only had 1 passing interception, but has been sacked 7 times this season. Their passing yards are 221 average passing yards per game for Sam Darnold and 180 average passing yards per game for Kyler Murray. You do have Kyler Murray averaging 35.6 rushing yards per game, and Sam Darnold only averaging 4.5 rushing yards per game. And I like to just quickly look through the breakdown of week by week just to see how consistent they are. You have a subpar first week for Sam Darnold with only 150 passing yards and no touchdowns. But since then, he's done a little better with 295 passing yards in the second game and 2 touchdowns, as well as 218 passing yards in the third game against New Orleans with only 2 passing touchdowns. And 218 yards against New Orleans with 2 passing touchdowns. Kyler Murray's been a little bit more of the opposite with only 163 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns in the first game, 220 passing yards in the second game against Carolina with 1 passing touchdown, and then back down to 159 passing yards against San Francisco with 1 passing touchdown. And looking at the running backs, you have Kenneth Walker for Seattle, and you have Trey Benson now because James Conner is hurt and on injured reserve, so Trey Benson's going to be the starting running back. We do have some information from him, which when I looked at it, actually looks better than James Conner's numbers. So he might do better off than James Conner in the end. We'll just have to see. So starting at the top, you have Kenneth Walker with 37.2 fantasy points in a non-PPR format. You have him with 42.2 points in PPRs. You have Trey Benson with 17 points in non-PPR formats and 25 in PPR formats. And if we look defensively across the board, none of them have lost any fumbles, both for rushing or receiving. Looking at the averages, you have Kenneth Walker with 54.3 average rushing yards per game, and you have Trey Benson getting 41.6 average rushing yards per game. Again, being the second string, still not bad even compared to Kenneth Walker's numbers. They both have a couple receptions per game, couple to a few receptions per game, averaging about 10 receiving yards for Kenneth Walker and averaging about 15 receiving yards per game for Trey Benson. If we look at the breakdown, you have 20 rushing yards in the first game for Kenneth Walker, 105 rushing yards in the second game with one rushing touchdown, and 38 rushing yards in the third game with two rushing touchdowns. So, fantasy points probably made up for it last week, but the yardage is pretty inconsistent, or at least on the lower level, with only 1 week breaking 100 yards. Over here for Trey Benson, you have 69 rushing yards in the first game, 14 in the second, and 42 in the third one here. So, given that he's always been shadowed by having James Conner in front of him, maybe he will get a little bit more. Seems like he's able to produce some numbers, so we'll have to see how he does. And just looking at the number one wide receivers on both teams, you have Jackson Smith-Njigba and Marvin Harrison Jr. So if we start with the fantasy points, you have Jackson with 58.3 fantasy points in PPR formats, 36.3 in non-fantasy PPR formats or non-PPR formats, and 36.3 in non-PPR formats. Meanwhile, you have Marvin Harrison Jr. with much lower numbers with 30.2 PPR points and 20.2 non-PPR points. You do have no fumbles from Marvin Harrison Jr., but you do have 2 receiving fumbles, one of which was lost from Jackson Smith-Njigba. Looking at our averages, you get 107.6 average receiving yards per game from Jackson Smith and 47.3 on average for Marvin Harrison Jr. So significantly almost more than half is less in each game, even though he's the largest share of receiving yards, with Trey closely behind him. But we just saw that, they're pretty low in the passing rank. They have pretty low average passing yards per game, so that would help explain the lower amounts for probably everybody on the team. Meanwhile, Jackson holds the largest share by far of receiving yards on the Seahawks. And breaking it down week by week, you have 124 receiving yards in the first week for Jackson, 103 in the second week for Jackson, and 96 in the last week for Jackson with one receiving touchdown. Both his fumbles came from the first week, but his yards are pretty average, over 100, so he's not as big boom, big bust. He's a little bit more consistent. Over here you have Marvin Harrison Jr. with 71 in the first week with one reception touchdown, but since then has been pretty quiet with only 27 receiving yards in the second game and 44 in the last game, with no touchdowns in both those games. So that's really all I have for today for this game. I will continue to add more of those stats I still want to. I think that you'll see a lot more for Sunday. That's the goal. With all of that said, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that it was helpful. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more, and tell me how I can do better or what you would want to see more of down in the comments below. And thank you all for watching.